Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you remember an old memory better after learning something new, even though logically, the new stuff should just make you forget the old stuff? Well, this new study might have a clue. Today we're diving into a fascinating study about how our memories work, especially when we learn new things that are related to old memories. You know how sometimes learning something new can actually help you remember something older, instead of just making you forget it? This phenomenon is called retroactive facilitation, and it is a bit of a puzzle because usually we think learning new things just messes up our old memories, causing what scientists call retroactive interference. This paper explores how and why this happens, and it involves looking at how much time passes between learning things and how well we notice when something has changed. Alright, so scientists ran two big experiments to figure this out. They had people learn word pairs. Imagine learning ocean goes with spray, then later on they might see ocean again, but this time it goes with salty. This is an ABAC setup, where A is the cue like ocean, B is the first response spray, and C is the new response salty. They played around with how many other word pairs were shown between ocean spray and ocean salty, which they call the lag. They also messed with how much time passed between learning ocean salty and being tested on ocean. The coolest part is, they asked people if they noticed the response changing from spray to salty when they saw the second pair. They found that when people noticed the change and remembered it later, their memory for the original pair, ocean, spray, actually got better. This got better as more time passed between learning the second pair and being tested. In experiment 1, they really drilled down on this. They used this ABAC setup with word pairs and tested people in different ways. They wanted to see if noticing a change at one point helped with remembering both the old and new words later. They specifically looked at how much people remembered the first word, the spray in our example. They found that when people remembered the change, they remembered the first word better. And this memory boost for the first word got stronger as more time passed after learning the second word pair. It is like the new information acted as a trigger to strengthen the old memory, but only if you paid attention to the change. Now, how they figured this out involved some fancy math and statistics. They used something called logistic mixed effects models. Think of it like a super smart way of analyzing data that can handle lots of different factors at once and account for the fact that some people might be better at remembering than others, or some word pairs might just be easier to remember. They use things like odds ratios, which are basically a way to say how much more likely something is to happen. For example, if the odds ratio for remembering a word is 2, it means you are twice as likely to remember it under one condition compared to another. They also adjusted for things like lag and retention interval, trying to find patterns in the data. So, what did they find in terms of remembering the first word? Well, they saw both forgetting and remembering. For the single AB items, meaning items where there was no change, memory generally got worse as more time passed. This is pretty normal forgetting. But for the ABAC items where there was a change, things got interesting. They saw this retroactive facilitation, where remembering the first response actually improved, especially over longer periods of time. This facilitation was strongest when people noticed the change. And what about noticing the change? They found that the better people were at noticing the change during the study phase, the better their memory tended to be later. This makes sense. If you catch that ocean spray became ocean salty, you are already engaged with the memory in a way that's likely to help. But they also found that noticing the change got harder the longer the lag was, meaning the more other word pairs were shown in between. Then, they checked if people still remembered that a change had happened when they were tested later. This is called change recollection. They found that when people had noticed the change during study, they were more likely to remember that it had changed later on. This change awareness seemed to be key to getting that memory boost, that retroactive facilitation. This is where it gets really cool. They broke down the results based on whether people noticed the change and remembered it. If you noticed the change and remembered it, your recall for the first response was highest. If you noticed it but didn't remember it later, your recall was okay, but not as good. And if you didn't notice the change at all, your recall for the first response was the lowest. This strongly suggests that paying attention to changes is directly linked to improving older memories. It is not just about remembering the change itself, but about the process of noticing the change that seems to strengthen the original memory. Experiment 1 was really good, but the researchers wanted an even better way to see if this notice the change process actually helped encode both the old and new information. So in experiment 2, they changed how they tested people. Instead of just asking for the first response, they used a method called modified free recall. This is basically where they asked people to just write down all the responses they could remember for a cue, and then tell them which response came first, second, or if it was the only one. This way, they could check memory for both the spray and the salty responses, and importantly, their order. The results in experiment 2 were pretty similar for the first response. They still saw that retroactive facilitation, especially over longer retention intervals, and it was still tied to noticing and remembering the change. When people noticed and remembered the change, they were better at recalling the first word. But the big finding here came from looking at the second response. The salty in our example, when people noticed and remembered the change, they were also better at recalling that second response. This is super important because it goes against the idea that noticing the change just makes you forget the new stuff to remember the old. Instead, it suggests that when you notice the change, your brain is doing something more active, encoding both the old and new information in relation to each other. It's like creating a richer memory. And it didn't stop there. When people noticed and remembered the change, they were also much better at correctly stating which response came first and which came second. This shows that they weren't just remembering the words, but also the order of events, which is a key part of memory. This strengthens the idea that noticing a change leads to a more organized and interconnected memory. So, what is the big takeaway from all this? The researchers found evidence for both forgetting and remembering. They confirmed that learning new related information can indeed make you forget older memories. That is the retroactive interference. This happens when you don't notice the change. But, and this is the exciting part, learning new information can also boost your memory for older information, that is retroactive facilitation. This boost happens specifically when you notice that something has changed and you remember that change later. This facilitation, this memory boost, seems to work best when there is enough time for the initial interference to fade, and it's directly linked to your change awareness. When you notice a change, your brain seems to work harder to integrate that new information with the old. This creates a more robust memory that includes not just the individual pieces of information, but also how they relate to each other and their order. This integrated memory is not only better remembered, but also helps you recall both the older and newer pieces of information more accurately. Now, even though this study is pretty cool, the scientists are upfront about its limits. They can't be 100% sure that every time someone noticed a change, they were actually retrieving the old memory. Sometimes, maybe just recognizing the ocean cue was enough to signal a change without fully recalling spray. Also, the ways they tested the timing of everything, the lags and retention intervals, were limited to what could be done in a single session. So they can't say for sure what happens over weeks or months, and they're still trying to figure out the exact best timing for these memory benefits. So in a nutshell, this study shows us that our memory isn't just a passive storage system. When we encounter new information that is related to old information, our brain actively works to update our memories. And a big part of that process is noticing and remembering when things change. This attention to change not only helps us keep track of new information, but can also strengthen our memories of older events, especially when there is enough time for that integration to happen. It highlights how important it is to be aware of adjustments and updates in our own lives, not just for remembering the new, but for reinforcing the old. And in a very modern twist, the authors also mentioned that they used AI tools like ChatGPT and Claude to help them write and refine the code and parts of the manuscript. This is becoming more common in scientific research today, though they assure us they fully reviewed and edited everything themselves. It is a peek into how science is being done now.